There is a people who should not exist where they exist, not because their survival against impossible odds was improbable, though it was, not because they held their ground against the most powerful military force on the continent for decades, though they did, but because the story we've been telling about them for over a century, it's wrong, and we have proof. Picture this. It's the Chiricahua Mountains, southern Arizona, late afternoon. The light doesn't just fall here, it transforms everything it touches. Rock faces turn copper, shadows go violet. The silence has a physical weight to it, the kind you feel in your chest. This is Apache territory, and standing here, knowing what the science now tells us, you realize something quietly unsettling. The people who walked this ground carried a secret inside their own bodies. A secret written in a language no historian ever thought to read. A secret that waited thousands of years for a technology that didn't exist until the 21st century to finally decode it. That technology is genomics, and what it found inside Apache DNA has rewritten everything. Let's start with what we thought we knew, because for a long time the story seemed airtight. The Apache are Athabascan-speaking people. That's a language family, one of the most geographically widespread in all of North America. It stretches from the frozen subarctic of Alaska and western Canada all the way down to the desert southwest, in a kind of broken vertical line across the continent. The Apache sit at the very bottom of that line, the southernmost tip. The explanation seemed obvious. At some point between 1200 and 1500 CE, ancestors of the Apache migrated south from the subarctic, from the same region where the Dean of Canada live today, where the Tlingit of coastal Alaska still speak related languages, where the Navajo, the Apache's closest linguistic relatives, also trace their roots. It was a slow migration, centuries of gradual movement. People following game, following seasons, following something that pulled them toward warmer land, toward the sun. The linguistic evidence was never in question. The language connection is real. It's documented, it's solid. So for 100 years the textbooks agreed, the historians agreed, the maps agreed, case closed. Except it wasn't. Archaeology started asking uncomfortable questions first. The dates didn't quite line up. When researchers tried to match the proposed migration timeline with actual physical evidence in the archaeological record, tools, pottery, burial sites, the pieces didn't snap together cleanly. And then there were the oral traditions. Apache oral histories described origins that pointed in directions historians had quietly decided to ignore, not because they studied those traditions and found them wrong, but because they didn't fit the model. So the model took priority. That's not science, that's convenience. The real disruption, though, came with DNA. In the early 2000s, something unprecedented began happening in research labs at Harvard, Stanford, and institutions across Europe. Scientists were mapping the deep ancestry of indigenous peoples across North and South America with a precision that had never been possible before. Not the simplified panels you'd order from a consumer ancestry kit. We're talking full whole genome sequencing. The kind of analysis that can detect population signals tens of thousands of years old. The kind that reads the architecture of ancient human movement, the skeleton of a continent's entire human history. Researchers were looking for migration routes, population splits, contact events between groups separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And when they ran that analysis on certain Apache populations, they found something they were not looking for. Embedded inside the Apache genome, not as background noise, not as a majority signal, but as a statistically consistent and reproducible presence, was a genetic signature associated with populations from coastal East Asia. Not Siberia, not the ancient Beringian crossing that all indigenous Americans share as a common foundation. Something distinct, something separate, something that, according to the data, appeared to have arrived through a different route, at a different time. The scientists published their findings carefully. They used cautious language. They listed alternative explanations. They did what responsible researchers do. But the signal was there. And it didn't go away. 3 theories emerged to explain it. None of them were comfortable. The first proposed a secondary migration across Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. The idea was that a later wave of East Asian peoples crossed after the original founding population, bringing a distinct genetic profile that eventually blended into groups that became Athabascan speakers, and eventually Apache. This was the most palatable explanation. It didn't require any dramatic revisions to the existing story. Just an addendum, a footnote. But when researchers modeled the timing carefully, the numbers didn't cooperate. The genetic divergence suggested the signal was too recent. Far too recent to match a Beringian crossing that would have happened thousands of years earlier. The timeline was off, significantly off. The second theory was more controversial, more uncomfortable. It proposed transoceanic contact, not Norse, not Mediterranean, not anything European textbooks had ever entertained seriously. East Asian contact, specifically maritime peoples from coastal China or Japan, navigating the Kuroshio Current, crossing the North Pacific, and making landfall on the coast of North America. The Kuroshio Current is the Pacific's equivalent of the Gulf Stream. It sweeps northeast from the Philippine Sea, follows the coastline of Japan, arcs across the North Pacific, and curves toward the Pacific northwest coast of North America. A vessel caught in it, even accidentally, could theoretically complete that crossing without deliberate navigation. We actually have historical documentation of this happening. Japanese fishing vessels, disabled in storms, have been recorded washing ashore in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. In at least 2 cases from the 19th century, the crews arrived alive. What was once dismissed as maritime folklore now had a genomic argument behind it, which made it harder to ignore, but also harder to prove. The third theory was the strangest of all, and it came not from geneticists, but from a small group of archaeologists working specifically in the American Southwest. Their proposal, the anomalous genetic signal, wasn't evidence of outside contact at all. It was evidence that the Apache themselves were not entirely who we thought they were, that somewhere in the formation of the Apache as a distinct people, a separate population had been absorbed, a group that already carried East Asian ancestry through a route and at a time that no existing model had accounted for. Not a migration from outside, an integration from within. 3 theories. 3 different stories about who the Apache fundamentally are, where they come from, and what that means for everything we thought we knew about human movement across this continent. Then, in 2021, the shape of the entire conversation changed. A landmark study out of the University of Copenhagen and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, 2 of the most respected institutions in ancient DNA research in the world, produced findings that couldn't be talked around. The team was led by Dr. Eski Willerslev. If you don't know that name, here's why it matters. Willerslev has spent 30 years constructing a global map of human prehistory from ancient remains. He is one of the foremost authorities on ancient DNA on the planet. This is not a fringe researcher. This is not someone prone to overclaiming. The team performed genomic analysis on ancient remains from across the Americas and cross-referenced them with modern populations, using a vastly expanded reference panel of Asian genomes. Populations from the Pacific coast of China, the Japanese archipelago, island Southeast Asia. Their primary goal was not specifically to study the Apache. They were building a global map of human migration. But the Apache data stood out. When the team modeled the ancestry components of modern Apache individuals using this expanded reference panel, the East Asian signal could not be explained by Beringian ancestry alone. The component matched most closely with populations from the Japanese archipelago and coastal China, with a divergence date pointing to somewhere between 500 BCE and 1000 CE. Not ancient, not primordial. Relatively recent. In genetic terms, almost yesterday. The paper was cautious, as academic papers must be. But Willerslev, speaking to journalists after publication, was notably less restrained than the text itself. He described the data, in his own words, as difficult to explain through any currently accepted overland migration model. Difficult to explain. Those 2 words from that man in that context are not small. They are the sound of a century-old story starting to crack. Here is what you need to sit with. The Apache were always understood through the lens of the history that others wrote about them. Feared warriors, nomadic survivors, Athabascan migrants from the north. The story was always told from the outside. What the DNA is now telling us is something more complicated and more human. Peoples are not pure streams running in a single direction from a single source. They are rivers, fed by tributaries that arrive from unexpected directions at unexpected times, through routes that no historian predicted and no map ever recorded. Somewhere in the deep past, across an ocean that everyone assumed was a barrier, something moved, people moved, and the echo of that movement has been living inside the Apache for over 1,000 years, waiting to be found. What happened on that crossing? Who were those people? Were they merchants, fishermen, castaways caught in a current they couldn't escape? Were they terrified or determined? Did they know what they were sailing toward, or did a coastline simply appear one morning where they expected only open water? The genome tells us the contact happened. It does not tell us the story of the contact. And that, right there, is where this investigation is only beginning. Let's talk about the ocean, because that's what this story keeps coming back to. The Pacific Ocean is the largest geographical feature on the surface of this planet. It covers more area than all of the world's land masses combined. At its widest point, between Southeast Asia and the coast of South America, it stretches across nearly 11,000 miles of open water. For most of recorded history, Western scholars treated it as a wall, an ending, a void, the edge of the world in a very practical sense. The assumption was simple: you don't cross that by accident. You don't cross it at all without the kind of maritime technology that most ancient cultures weren't supposed to have. So the Pacific wasn't a route, it was a boundary. And that assumption shaped everything. Every migration model, every map, every theory about how the Americas were populated and by whom. The problem is that the assumption was wrong. And we've known it was wrong for longer than most people realize. The Kuroshio current. In Japanese, the name means black stream, and if you look at satellite imagery of the North Pacific, you can actually see why. The current is visibly darker than the surrounding water, warmer, faster, running like a river within the ocean itself. It originates in the Philippine Sea. It flows northeast along the eastern coast of Japan, accelerating as it goes. Then it arcs east and northeast across the open North Pacific, carrying warm water toward the coast of North America, specifically toward the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, the coast of what is now Oregon and Washington State. Ocean current specialists have known about this pathway for centuries. Maritime historians have known it. What they didn't fully model until recently was what it meant for human movement. Here's the key thing about the Kuroshio that most people don't know. If you are on a vessel in that current, even a damaged vessel, even a vessel with no working sails, the current itself will carry you. You don't have to navigate. You don't have to know where you're going. You just have to survive long enough for the ocean to deliver you. The crossing from the coast of Japan to the Pacific Northwest, traveling within the Kuroshio, takes somewhere between 2 and 4 months depending on conditions. A long time to be at sea, a brutal time. But not an impossible time for people accustomed to extended ocean voyaging. And we have documented proof that people survived it. Between 1800 and 1900, there are at least 11 recorded cases of Japanese vessels being found adrift or washed ashore along the Pacific coast of North America. Vessels disabled by storms. Vessels that lost their rudders in bad weather. Vessels crewed by fishermen who had no intention of crossing an ocean. In at least 2 of those cases, crew members were recovered alive. One of the most documented incidents involved a vessel called the Hojun Maru, which ran into trouble in 1832. After drifting for over a year across the Pacific, 3 surviving crew members, out of an original crew of 14, were found off the coast of what is now the state of Washington. They hadn't planned to cross the Pacific. They didn't navigate the crossing. The ocean carried them. Now, hold that thought. Because here's the question the geneticists started asking. If this happened in the 19th century, documented, verifiable, on record, what happened in the centuries before that? In the centuries when there was no one waiting on the other shore to write it down? In 2017, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Current Biology that attempted to model the probability of accidental transoceanic crossings via the Kuroshio current across the past 5,000 years. They used ocean current data, historical vessel types, survival probability estimates, and population models. Their finding was not that accidental crossings were impossible or even rare. Their finding was that given the volume of maritime activity along the Japanese and Chinese coastlines across 5 millennia, accidental crossings were statistically expected to have occurred multiple times per century. Multiple times per century. Not once in a generation, not once in a lifetime. Regularly, repeatedly. With enough frequency that the real question isn't whether contact happened. The real question is why we assumed it didn't. Now connect this back to the Apache. The genetic signal found in Apache populations, the one that matched most closely with populations from the Japanese archipelago and coastal China, carries a divergence date falling between 500 BCE and 1000 CE. That's a window of roughly 1500 years. 1500 years during which the Kuroshio current was running exactly as it runs today. During which maritime communities along the Japanese and Chinese coasts were among the most sophisticated ocean-going peoples in the ancient world. During which, statistically, crossings were happening. And here's what the population geneticists modeled next, the part that makes the story click into place. You don't need a large group to leave a permanent genomic signature. You don't need an armada. You don't need a colony or a deliberate settlement. You need a small number of individuals, even just a handful of survivors from a single vessel, who were absorbed into existing coastal populations. If those individuals reproduced within an existing community, their genetic material entered the local population's gene pool. If the community grew and moved, the signal moved with it. If, over generations, that community merged with others, traveled south, traded, intermarried with neighboring groups, the signal dispersed. Slowly, over centuries, diluting but not disappearing. Moving south along the interior pathways of the continent, reaching, eventually, the desert southwest. Reaching the people who would become the Apache. This is not a dramatic story. There's no moment of first contact that changed history overnight. It's quieter than that, more human than that. It's just people meeting other people, as people have always done. And biology doing what biology does, keeping a record that no one thought to look for, in a place no one thought to look. But there's another layer to this that most coverage of the Apache DNA story has missed entirely. And it connects back to something the Apache themselves have always said. Apache oral traditions, the stories that were passed down through generations, the ones that historians spent a century politely setting aside, contain references to origins that don't map cleanly onto the southward migration from Canada model. Certain traditions speak of crossings, of water, of ancestors who came from directions that don't match the overland route from the subarctic. For a long time, those references were interpreted as metaphor, as spiritual language, as the kind of poetic origin story that every culture constructs to explain itself to itself. Researchers didn't take them literally because the literal interpretation didn't fit the model they already had. The Apache elders who spoke, briefly, carefully, on their own terms, with researchers connected to the genomic studies, didn't react to the findings with shock. One elder, whose name was not shared at her request, said something that has stayed with the researchers who heard it. She said, "We always knew we came from far away. We just didn't know how far." Think about what that means. A living oral tradition, passed down across hundreds of generations, preserved a memory, not a specific event, not a date, not a name, but a directional truth. A sense of deep origin that pointed somewhere other than north. The genome confirmed it. The story and the science are pointing at the same thing. This is the part of the research where the ground starts to shift under your feet in a way that goes beyond the Apache specifically. Because if a transoceanic contact event left a traceable genomic signature in a population that eventually became the Apache, then the question immediately becomes, where else? And the answer, it turns out, is complicated and still unfolding. In 2020, a separate genomic study examining indigenous populations in the Amazon basin of South America found traces of ancestry most closely associated with populations from Australia and Melanesia. The signal was faint, but it was reproducible, and the researchers, again careful senior academics at well-funded institutions, could not explain it through any standard migration model. In 2022, A study of ancient remains from coastal California found population signals that overlapped with the Pacific Island contact findings in ways that raised the same questions. The Pacific, it is becoming clear, was not a wall. It was a highway. An irregular highway, dangerous, unpredictable, dependent on currents and luck and survival. But a highway nonetheless. One that human beings traveled more frequently, in more directions, and starting earlier than any academic consensus had been willing to accept. The Apache story isn't an isolated anomaly. It's a window into a much larger rethinking of what we know, or thought we knew, about how this hemisphere was populated. Now, you've been watching this, and at some point you might be wondering whether there's a way to actually explore your own deep ancestry beyond the consumer tests that give you broad regional percentages and call it a day. There is, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. Most of what the researchers in these studies used is whole genome sequencing combined with population-level reference panels, the kind that compare your DNA not just to modern populations, but to ancient samples from archaeological sites. The free version of this? The accessible version? It starts with raw DNA data. If you've already done a consumer test, any of the major ones, you can download your raw data file directly from their website. It's usually in your account settings under something like Raw Data or DNA Download. That file contains your actual genomic markers. Then you can upload that raw data to open access tools like GEDmatch or the Gedrosia Ancient Calculator, both free, which run your markers against ancient population reference panels and show you population components that go back thousands of years further than the standard reports. That's real information, genuinely useful. But that's only part of what the researchers in these studies are working with. The deeper analysis, the kind that catches signals like the East Asian component in Apache DNA, requires full whole genome sequencing and access to proprietary ancient DNA reference panels. If you want the full picture, the link is in the description. But stay with me, because what comes next is the part that changes how you understand everything we've covered so far. Let's go back to the bones. Not metaphorically, literally. Because the most important breakthroughs in this entire story didn't come from living people. They came from remains pulled out of the earth, from burial sites, from cave floors, from the kind of careful, painstaking archaeological work that takes years to produce a single result. Ancient DNA analysis, a DNA in the shorthand researchers use, is one of the most technically demanding fields in modern science. You're working with genetic material that has been degrading for hundreds or thousands of years. Material contaminated by soil bacteria, by water, by the hands of every person who ever touched the remains. For a long time, it was considered nearly impossible to extract usable genetic information from ancient samples with any reliability. Then the field cracked open, and when it didn't just give us new data. It gave us a completely different way of asking questions about the past. The breakthrough came in stages. In 2010, a team led by Svante Pääbo, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for this work, successfully sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal from a 50,000-year-old bone fragment. A 50,000-year-old bone fragment. The implications were staggering. If you could read a genome that old, you could read anything. You could go back further than any written record, further than any oral tradition, further than any artifact. You could read the history of a species directly from its biology. Within a decade, a DNA analysis had transformed archaeology. Migrations that had been debated for generations were resolved. Population replacements that no one suspected were documented. Contact events between groups separated by thousands of miles were confirmed. And certain things that mainstream archaeology had insisted couldn't have happened, turned out to have happened. The Apache genomic story sits inside this larger transformation. It is one data point, a significant one, a striking one, in a wholesale revision of what we know about how human beings moved across this planet. Let's be precise about what the 2021 Copenhagen and Max Planck study actually found. Because the details matter, and most popular coverage gets them slightly wrong. The study analyzed genomic data from over 300 ancient individuals from across the Americas. combined with data from nearly 2,000 modern individuals representing populations from every inhabited continent. The reference panel, the comparison database, included ancient samples from Siberia, Central Asia, coastal China, the Japanese archipelago, island Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. This was significantly more comprehensive than any previous study of indigenous American ancestry. When the researchers modeled the ancestry components of modern Apache individuals against this expanded panel, they identified a component that could not be accounted for by the three standard layers of indigenous American ancestry. Those three standard layers are, first, the ancient North Eurasian ancestry that all indigenous Americans share, which traces back to the populations that crossed Beringia during the last ice age. Second, a component associated with ancient North Siberians. Third, a component associated with East Asian populations from the period of the Beringian crossing. Every indigenous American population carries some combination of those three. The Apache carried something additional, a fourth component, one that matched most closely, when run against the expanded reference panel, with populations from the Japanese archipelago and the coastal regions of what is now eastern China. And critically, the statistical modeling placed the date of that component's entry into the Apache ancestral lineage at somewhere between 500 BCE and 1000 CE. To put that in perspective, 500 BCE is the era of ancient Greece, of Confucius, of the Persian Empire, the era when maritime civilizations along the Pacific coast of Asia were already conducting sophisticated open ocean navigation. 1000 CE is the era of the Viking exploration of North America, an event that was itself considered impossible mythology until archaeology confirmed it in the 1960s. The genetic signal in Apache DNA is roughly contemporaneous with the period when we know, from other evidence, that Pacific maritime cultures were at the height of their seafaring capabilities. That's not a coincidence that researchers are comfortable dismissing. Now here's where the story gets even more complex, because there's a question that the genomic data raises but cannot answer by itself. If a group of East Asian individuals, however they arrived, whatever route they took, made contact with populations on the North American coast, why did that genetic signal end up specifically in Apache-related lineages? Why not in coastal California populations, which were geographically the most likely landing zone? Why not in Pacific Northwest groups, which sit directly in the path of the Kuroshio current? This is the question that has generated the most debate among researchers since the 2021 study was published. And the answer, or the most plausible working answer, comes back to population dynamics. Coastal California and Pacific Northwest populations were dense, established, complex societies with strong internal structures, trade networks, and defined territorial boundaries. Small groups of newcomers arriving on those coasts would have had limited genetic impact on populations that already numbered in the tens of thousands. The signal would have been diluted almost immediately. But if those same individuals, or their descendants, moved inland, if they were absorbed into smaller, more mobile groups, if those groups traveled, merged with others, experienced population bottlenecks, moments where the total population shrank dramatically and certain genetic variants became proportionally more represented, then the signal could have been preserved, carried, moved through generations and geography in ways that a static coastal population would never have allowed. The Apache as a people were extraordinarily mobile. Their entire historical identity is built around movement, adaptation, and the ability to absorb and integrate. That characteristic, the thing that made them militarily formidable against the United States Army, may also be the thing that preserved an ancient genetic signature that would have vanished in any settled population. The very quality that made them who they are may be why we can still read this story at all. There's one more piece of this that almost no coverage has addressed, and it connects the Apache specifically to a much older question about the peopling of the Americas. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of how humans first arrived in North America was called the Clovis first hypothesis. The idea was simple. The first people in the Americas crossed the Bering Land Bridge around 13,000 years ago, spread south through an ice-free corridor in Canada, and became the ancestral population of all indigenous Americans. Neat, clean, agreed upon. Then a site in Chile called Monte Verde was conclusively dated to 14,500 years ago. South America, 14,500 years ago, before the ice-free corridor even opened. The Clovis first model collapsed. What replaced it is messier and more interesting. The current evidence points to multiple waves of migration, multiple routes, including a coastal route along the Pacific shoreline, and a timeline that stretches back potentially 20,000 years or more. The Americas were not populated in a single event by a single group moving in a single direction. They were populated the way everywhere else on Earth was populated, by people moving in every direction available to them, by land and by water, over thousands of years, in waves and trickles and sudden surges. The Apache genomic signal is part of that larger story, not an exception to the rule, evidence that the rule was wrong. I want to stop here and talk about something that sits underneath all of this research, something that isn't about DNA or migration routes or statistical modeling. It's about what we owe to the people whose history we're discussing. The Apache Nation, the various communities that constitute the Apache people today, did not ask to be the subject of a genomic mystery. They did not request that scientists spend decades debating where they came from. They have their own relationship with their own history, their own traditions, their own understanding of their origins. And they have been, for most of American history, the objects of other people's stories. First, the colonizers' stories, then the academic stories, now the science stories. Every generation finds a new way to look at the Apache from the outside and draw conclusions. What the researchers who conducted the most careful work in this field have been deliberate about, and what deserves to be said clearly, is that genetic findings about a people's deep ancestry do not redefine that people. They don't override identity. They don't replace oral tradition with a laboratory result and say, here is the truth, here is what you actually are. That's not what science is for. What the genomic data does is add a layer, a very old, very deep layer, one that confirms something the Apache tradition always held, that the story of this people is longer, stranger, and more connected to the wider human world than anyone on the outside was willing to believe. Dr. Ripon Marley, a geneticist at the University of Illinois, who has spent years working with Native American communities on DNA research, always with tribal consent, always with community involvement, has written about the need to hold scientific findings and indigenous knowledge in parallel, rather than treating one as the authority that validates or invalidates the other. That framing matters, because the Apache DNA story, told responsibly, isn't a story about science solving a mystery that the Apache couldn't solve themselves. It's a story about science finally catching up to something that was already known, in a different form, in a different language, preserved in a different kind of record. So where does this leave us? Here is what we know with high confidence, as of the most recent published research. Modern Apache populations carry a genetic component that cannot be explained by any known overland migration route from Asia to the Americas. That component most closely matches populations from the Japanese archipelago and coastal China. Its estimated date of entry into the Apache ancestral lineage falls within a 1500-year window, starting around 500 BCE. The most plausible mechanisms for this are a secondary migration via the Kuroshio current, either deliberate or accidental, involving East Asian maritime peoples who made contact with North American coastal populations, and whose descendants were eventually absorbed into the ancestral lineages of Athabascan-speaking groups. Here is what we do not know. We don't know the specific origin point of the individuals who carried this signal. We don't know whether it arrived in a single contact event or multiple. We don't know whether the people involved knew what they were doing or were carried by an ocean they couldn't control. We don't know the names of the communities on the American coast that absorbed them. We don't know their story. Only that they had one, and that it was real. History is not a completed document. It is an ongoing excavation. And the deeper we dig, into the earth, into the genome, into the traditions that outlasted the people who first spoke them, the more clearly we can see that human beings have always been more connected, more mobile, and more surprising than the stories we told ourselves allowed for. The Apache were never what we thought. And here's the uncomfortable truth that follows from that. Neither were any of the other peoples whose histories we thought we had figured out. Every confident line on every map of ancient human migration is a hypothesis wearing the costume of a fact. The genome is the only witness that never lies, never forgets, and never rewrites itself to suit the politics of the moment. And it is still talking. Drop a number in the comments, 1, 2, or 3. 1 if the Kuroshio current evidence hit hardest. 2 if it was the Apache oral tradition being confirmed by science. 3 if it was the realization that the entire Clovis first model was wrong all along. I want to know which piece of this landed differently for you than you expected. Forward this to one person you know who thinks history is settled, who believes the textbook version is the final version. One person who would genuinely be unsettled, in the best possible way, to learn that the bones are still talking and the story isn't over. Send it to them without context. Just send it. Let them find their own number. Next week, I'm going into a story that makes this one look straightforward. There is a site in Turkey, buried, excavated, partially reburied by the government, where the construction dates are so far outside accepted archaeological timelines that 3 separate institutions have quietly distanced themselves from their own published findings. I have the original field notes, and what they show has never been discussed on this platform. See you then.